I have a pretty interesting question here. It comes from a part of a verse in Matthew chapter 18. And this question came from a friend of a friend kind of thing, where somebody said, "Hey, ask the pastor what he thinks about this verse." The verse in question is Matthew chapter 18, verse 10, where it says, "Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven." So the question was, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that there are angels that protect children? Do children have guardian angels? It's a matter of opinion, but the answer is in the context. Context is king whenever you're reading the Bible. There have been those who have believed in guardian angels. Jews believed that every Jewish person had a guardian angel that watched over them. These angels, my understanding, were lesser angels that would not have seen the face of God like the angels do here in Matthew chapter 18, verse 10. But the question is, what is Jesus actually talking about? In Matthew 18, he starts off talking about humility, really, and he says that the disciples have to humble themselves and become like little children. And he kind of continues to go over that sort of picture of believers being like little children. You can't enter the kingdom of God, can't enter heaven unless you are like a little child. You can't offend little children, because if you offend one of these little children and cause them to sin, God will judge you. In verse 6, he continues to go through that theme, and he talks about being very careful. He even goes so far in verse 8, he says, look, if your hand causes you to sin, it's best if you just cut it off. And if your eye causes you to sin, it's best you just pluck it out. And he's talking about causing offense to the little children, causing offense to yourself as a believer or to other believers, causing other believers to stumble, causing yourself to stumble. If your hand causes you to stumble, then it's best for you to cut your hand off. If your eye causes you to stumble, it's best to pluck your eyes out. And if you cause another believer to stumble, then this is what's going to happen to you, is what he says in verse 10, that you don't despise the little ones. Most people agree, and you can go read different commentaries on this. You can read John MacArthur or other famous commentators, and most people pretty much agree that the little children here is not actually little children. It's not actually little ones. It's Jesus playing off of this picture of believers being like innocent children, becoming innocent and humble and meek like children are, and depending on Christ to protect you. The little children, just given from the context of what Jesus is talking about, is probably not children. It's probably just Christian. You could probably include children in there, but the little ones seems to be just people and not children at all. With that in mind, you say, well, does that mean that people have guardian angels? Well, I don't really think so. I think that it seems to be that what Jesus is saying is that in general, that God looks out for the church in general. He looks out for people in general. He uses angels to do this oftentimes. So I don't think that Jesus is communicating here an idea of having a guardian angel. I don't think he's communicating that children have guardian angels in particular. I think that God protects his people and looks out for his people. And so it's really a rebuke. Sometimes we talk about church bullies and people who, they go around, they criticize other church members, they criticize their pastor. We've all seen things like that. I'll never forget a story from a friend of some church members who got together and agreed not to tithe and told other members not to tithe so that would hurt the church. This idea of people that are kind of scheming against the church or scheming against Christians, believers that have made themselves like little children. That's what Jesus seems to be talking about. You don't offend these children. You don't offend people who count on Jesus. You don't attack and scheme against people who count on Jesus. You don't try to make people who count on Jesus sin. If you do those things, like I said, I think the picture there is, what does he just get done saying? Look, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. The message is, if you cause one of my children to sin, if you cause one of my children to stumble, someone who trusts me and believes in me, what do you think I'm going to do to you? because I have angels that stand before God's throne that are just waiting to take his orders and execute his orders. And he's looking out for his children. So you shouldn't ever work against or plot against or scheme against or offend these children who depend on me. Again, I just think that those children here in Matthew chapter 18 are just Christians. I think they're just believers. I don't think that it's talking about little children at all. I think it's just talking, Jesus is speaking to the protection that God has given to people who believe in him and the danger of working against people who trust in Jesus. And so, yeah, it's a good question. Very interesting. Hope that answers your question.